This is the Elite Sport Mentality Podcast with me, Tom Evans. Welcome to the Elite Sport Mentality Podcast, where we'll be exploring all things sports psychology. Whether you're an athlete, coach, or sports enthusiast, this podcast is your go-to resource for understanding the mental side to sports performance. Each episode, I'll be talking to someone from the world of sport or sports psychology to get their insights into the mental side of their sport. We'll delve into the latest research, share inspiring stories from top athletes, and provide practical tips to you to enhance your mental skills. Join me as I look to unlock the secrets to an elite sport mentality. Let's go. Okay. Welcome to the Elite Sport Mentality Podcast with me, Tom Evans. I'm joined today by my friend Abi Woodliffe-Thomas, who I know from about working with her at Tottenham Hotspur Academy. We'll kind of go into her journey in a moment. But Abi's a sports nutritionist, so we're going to talk all things sort of eating disorders and disordered eating today. It maybe seems a little bit unusual to have a nutritionist on what is a sports psychology podcast, but disordered eating disorders is one of those topics that kind of sits in between the two sort of disciplines, I suppose. So first off, thank you, Abi. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. Really looking forward to chatting and catching up.
Yeah, perfect. So like I say, the topic of eating disorders sort of sits in between the two worlds. So we'll kind of get stuck into that in a moment. But just first off, I always like to kind of get a bit of background for our listeners on the person I'm talking to. So can you just give me a bit of a background to your sporting background first, I suppose?
Yeah, so I grew up as an elite gymnast. So I was a gymnast for 12 years. And I guess that was predominantly all I did as a child. Was training kind of 25 hours a week. So I kind of saw my gymnastics coaches more than my parents, and it was all I ever really knew. I retired from gymnastics when I was 18. Weird to kind of say retirement, but then kind of fell in love with simple things like going to the gym and running, and dabbled in a little bit of CrossFit. But kind of exercise for me has been such a big part of my life that I can't really imagine that side of sport or that kind of physical activity not being a part of my life.
Mm-hmm. And then, so just a bit more about your gymnastics. Like, what sort of level were you at? Like, what kind of level did you participate and compete at?
Yeah, so I did acrobatic gymnastics, which isn't really televised. It's not in the Olympics. So it's kind of, I worked in something called a trio. So there was three of us. I would throw somebody in the air. They'd do multiple somersaults and I'd catch them again, or I'd balance them on my arms and my legs and they would do handstands. I was fortunate enough to kind of compete nationally and internationally, medaling at kind of like the national and international level and competing for England, which was really cool. So yeah, looking back on it now, it's kind of awesome to see the successes that I endured.
Yeah, and what age did you stop, just for kind of context?
Yeah, so I retired when I was 18, so okay, just before my A-levels, which is actually a pretty common time for gymnasts to retire. But yeah, so 12 years and retired at 18.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers, but I can imagine that's quite across all sports. That must be quite a high dropout rate for athletes starting to kind of get more serious with academics and stuff like that.
So yeah, for sure.
So that's just good. Obviously, with the people listening, predominantly the YTP or the DICE learners that I work with are 16 to 18-year-olds. So it's good to say they understand your background and you've been in a similar position, working at competing at the highest level in your area at that age as well. And then you've obviously then transitioned into sports nutrition. So just from, I always like to touch on it from like an employability point of view, because again, a lot of the athletes listen to this will be thinking about what they're going to do alongside their sport or after their sport. And in the sport, obviously a lot of them want to stay in the sports area. So sports nutrition does come up a lot with regards to conversations with athletes of what they might want to go on and do. So can you just talk me through that pathway? How do you or how can you become a sports nutritionist?
Yeah, of course. So when I was kind of at school, the idea of going to uni was something that I really didn't want to do. I'm such a home bird and I love being at home. So the thought of kind of going away was just it didn't really cross my mind. And I guess in my last year of A-levels, I actually wanted to be a PE teacher. But then when I kind of realized that you got to stand outside in the cold and in the rain doing hockey in November, it very quickly changed my mind. And my PE teacher at the time, who I'm actually still in contact with now, she was like, look, apply for uni, go and do sports science. And then like that gives you so many different options and avenues. So I went to Loughborough. I did my undergrad in sports and exercise science at Loughborough, and then subsequently stayed at Loughborough to do my master's in performance nutrition and exercise physiology. And I think just from almost kind of the first year of being at Loughborough, I was stuck between kind of, do I go into S&C or do I go into nutrition? And kind of from my experience as an athlete myself, and especially in the aesthetic sport of gymnastics, the kind of talk and the noise around food was really big and really prominent. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to change that. And I wanted nutrition to be seen as something that can really enhance performance rather than something that is potentially going to be demonized. And kind of learning about the physiological enhancements of performance simply just by supplementing different foods or utilizing different foods just astonished me so much. And I mean, getting paid to talk about food all day is pretty cool. So that's kind of how I got into the nutrition space.
Yeah, nice. And so now you're obviously working in the area. What kind of organisations have you worked in, and where are you at the moment with regards to where you're working? Obviously, we can see what you're wearing. Might give us a bit of a clue, but what have you been and where are you at the moment?
Yeah, so during my time at uni, I was lucky that I did a few internships. So I worked for Durham Cricket Club and the Derbyshire First Team Cricket Club alongside the ECB. When I finished uni, I went straight into football, which is pretty common in all kind of like nutrition realms. It's where the jobs are kind of readily available. So I was the lead academy nutritionist at Queen's Park Rangers, so QPR Football Club. And then alongside my work there, I was kind of doing a few other things. So working with some one-to-one clients, doing a lot of kind of free work. And I guess that's something I want to caveat, that a lot of things that you do in sport, you do for free. And it's just about building your portfolio. But I would do presentations at local rugby clubs and football clubs. And then I kind of dipped my toe in the water in the ultra endurance space. I'm fortunate enough to do some work with a company called Ultra X. I've traveled kind of all over the world with them, working with people running crazy distances, like 250 kilometers, which is kind of where my passion truly lies. Following my time at QPR Football Club, I met you and we worked together at Tottenham Hotspur Academy. And then after my time at Tottenham Hotspur, I moved into the UKSI, so UK Sports Institute, which for me has always been a career goal to go to the Olympics as a practitioner. And I work with the GB diving team. And then actually on Monday, I'm starting a new job covering the whole of Aquatics GB. So I'll be the nutritionist for swimming, diving, artistic swimming, alongside my colleague Ollie Turner. And we're going to be kind of heading up Aquatics GB into the LA 28 cycle.
Amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And so that's incredibly varied work. So you go from ultramarathon to working with divers. I can imagine it's quite interesting to work with different populations, different athletes with different needs and stuff. So you go to sports science undergrad, you do your masters. So sports science undergrad is what I did. Then I specialised in sports psychology at masters. So then your name, like a lot of names in the sport world, has load of numbers, load of letters after it as well. So what kind of accreditations and stuff do you have to do once you've done your masters, or what did you do?
Yeah, so sports nutrition and nutrition itself isn't actually kind of a recognised title. So anybody out there can be a nutritionist or claim they're a nutritionist doing kind of an hours online platform. However, we have to be accredited to something called the SENR, which is a Sports and Exercise Nutrition Register. Loughborough Uni isn't actually an affiliated uni to that register, so I had to kind of fulfill a big kind of portfolio. But I was then and am currently on the graduate register. And then the next kind of step in that registration process is becoming a SENR practitioner registrant. And I'm in the process of doing that now, and that should all be kind of concluded by October this year. So it just gives you that higher kind of accountability and higher like authority behind you as a practitioner.
Yeah. Okay, nice. Okay, so let's get stuck into the topic itself. So eating disorders, disordered eating, like they're two terms that people listening to this may have heard quite a lot, definitely eating disorders. But what are eating disorders, and what is disordered eating, and what is the difference between those two terms, would you say?
Yeah, so I think I'm actually going to start with a little bit of a weird analogy. So if you think back to when you're a child or a baby, you eat when you're hungry and you stop when you're full. And babies are so kind of in tune, and little kids are so in tune with their hunger cues and their hunger signals that it just becomes so intuitive. I think when we talk about disordered eating, this refers to kind of a range of irregular eating behaviors, but these don't meet the clinical criteria of what an eating disorder might meet. So the behaviors can include things like restrictive dieting, excessive exercise, being in kind of a binge restrict cycle, or having an obsession with only eating really, really clean or eating at specific times. And while disordered eating can impact health and performance, it is often overlooked and is even normalized in this day and age with the rise in diet culture, and especially in sport. But then if we kind of look on the flip side and we look at eating disorders, so such as things like anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, the difference here, and I guess the main difference, is that they are clinically diagnosed conditions with severe physiological, psychological consequences, with the highest mortality rate in any kind of mental health condition. They require medical and physiological intervention as well as psychological intervention, whereas disordered eating kind of exists on a spectrum, but if left unaddressed, disordered eating can kind of lead into that eating disorder territory.
Okay, so like we touched on before, at the start of the podcast or before we jumped on it, it's an area that it's a topic that sits in between the two worlds of sports psych and sports nutrition. I know me as someone who's worked with athletes, and the kind of disordered eating pops up. It's something that no specialist necessarily feels comfortable with, and I might kind of think, oh well, it's more of a nutrition issue. And then the nutritionists, I've definitely worked with some nutritionists in the past who felt the same, that they weren't comfortable with it and kind of thought, well, it sounds like a psychological issue, and it definitely is both, isn't it? So can you talk to me about, I suppose we'll look at the prevalence in a moment within the population, but can you talk to me about how have you supported athletes in the past, or have you supported athletes in the past that have had either of those things that we're discussing?
Yeah, I think you mentioned a really good point there about the fact that it's a condition whereby the whole of the multidisciplinary team is absolutely essential. Ultimately, an eating disorder is a psychological condition, and it's 99% of the time not actually about food. That's just the method of control whereby the individual is seizing to kind of calm the psychological aspects that are going on. So in my experience, I have worked with an individual or a few individuals with disordered eating. And the key there is, as a sports nutritionist, I'm not actually a clinical nutritionist. So leaning on people within the MDT, like the psychologist, so like yourself, to provide that psychological support, doing a lot of work with the doctor, so looking at things like blood profiles, etc. But also my job is to simply be not only a listening ear, but also to educate them around the importance of sufficient nutrition, not only to enhance their performance, but to ensure that their body is in a state of, not in a state of survival, but in a state of being able to thrive. I guess it's something, eating disorders are very a taboo subject. And like you mentioned just now, almost the psych might think it's a nutritionist, the nutritionist might think it's a psych, but everybody kind of collaborating together and singing off the same hymn sheet is the most important aspect for dealing with a condition like this, because ultimately the athlete wants to be heard, wants to be seen, and ensuring that everybody is kind of following the same protocols is super important for their development.
Yeah. And I suppose just an awareness of eating disorders is a bit easier, I suppose, easier to identify because that's got to a point where it's clinical and it's quite severe. What are sort of some of the disordered eating sort of behaviors, habits that you might typically see in the general population, but obviously with the elite athletes that we're fortunate to work with? Like, what kind of things might you see in an athlete who has some disordered eating?
Yeah, I guess the word dieting basically is an umbrella term for what disordered eating is. So potentially having rules around things that they can or can't consume, the feeling that they have to exercise to earn their food, I think is the most common kind of behavior that I encounter within my job. So individuals may think, oh, well, no, I can't have that birthday cake because I've not been on a run today, which is kind of the psychological aspect that kind of comes into it. And I think also kind of obsession with exercise or obsession with maybe the number on the scale. So having that continual almost obsession with, okay, I have to weigh myself every day, multiple times a day to see what the number is. And then that dictates what happens that day. Mm-hmm. And all of these aren't clinically, don't require kind of clinical attention. But like I said at the beginning, if left untreated and unrecognized or unnoticed, can really quite quickly spiral into a clinical eating disorder.
Yeah, and I guess it's difficult, isn't it? Because then athletes are encouraged to, maybe are encouraged, some others might not be, but they might be encouraged to calorie count, or they might be encouraged to track carbs, protein intake, or their weight and stuff like that from just a performance point of view where it's going to be beneficial to them. So where does that become too much, do you think? So it's important for them to take interest in their nutrition, have a kind of vested interest in what they're eating and stuff like that. So where does the line become kind of blurred, I suppose? When does it become on the scale of disordered eating, would you say, in your opinion?
Yeah, great question. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, because for an elite athlete, nutrition is an hugely important aspect. And for them to have that educational piece around it is not only going to enhance their performance and recovery, but on the flip side can actually cause a bit more damage than good. And I guess a few kind of stats. So in the general population, the prevalence of an eating disorder is about 3%. So BEAT, which is kind of the eating disorder helpline, in 2024 revealed that 1.25 million people in the UK population have an eating disorder. Mm-hmm. However, if we look then at the kind of athlete population, this is kind of 15 times higher in some sports that are maybe aesthetic sports. So like you said, maybe lightweight rowing or gymnastics or swimming or dancing, where their body is so much more on show. And the same as things like distance running, the prevalence hugely increases. But the kind of the key thing that I like to kind of promote as a nutritionist is educating athletes in a way in which suits them. So individualizing the education, but also always thinking about things that they can add in rather than things that they can take out. So I think a really key skill whilst being a nutritionist, and I guess it crosses over quite nicely into psych as well, is the ability to use your language really, really well. So never demonizing food around athletes, never being like the food police and saying, well, you can't eat that, you can't do this, you can't do that. Instead, kind of flipping the narrative and saying, okay, well, if we add in this, this, and this is going to really enhance X. And I think having a nutritionist that works like that and that talks like that and uses that language is a lot more kind of, it gives that almost breath of fresh air to the individuals, as opposed to kind of continually being demonized.
So what could it be like an example of that? So adding instead of taking away. So if you had an athlete who was demonstrating or demonstrating some of those behaviors that we've spoken about around their eating, what could you add? What, instead of saying, instead of taking stuff away, what could that actually look like in real life?
Yeah, so I guess the biggest and the easiest example to think about is simply adding in and using things that are already part of your daily nutritional intake, and simply just adding things that aren't going to be too overwhelming and feel like you're suddenly eating loads more. So if you think about breakfast, for example, the athlete might be having Weetabix and berries and some milk. You could simply say to them, okay, well, let's change the berries to a banana. Let's change your skimmed milk to semi-skimmed milk. And then let's drizzle a nice amount of honey and peanut butter on top as well. If you put them side by side, it's pretty much the same meal. However, the energy intake that they're going to be consuming is going to increase quite drastically, which at the end of the day is what we want to ensure for their performance to increase as well. I think then also another thing to kind of highlight in terms of kind of adding in is always thinking, okay, so you've got a salad for lunch, great, but where's the protein source? So let's add in a protein source. Let's add in that carbohydrate source for a form of recovery and energy. Let's add in some healthy fats to help with kind of muscle recovery and inflammation and satiety and hormones and female health. And if you kind of take something that they're already comfortable with and add things to it in a way in which is just going to enhance their performance, then you're more likely to get that buy-in.
Yeah, I think that's a nice message, isn't it? So that anyone listening who kind of recognises maybe some of those behaviours, it's like you don't have to completely rip up the rule book and start fresh. It's like, let's work with what you've got, and then there's simple things you can do to add a lot of, like say, calories or whatever they need that can help massively. So then looking at so if you're working with, if someone is listening to this, what would you recommend if they're kind of listening to this thinking, okay, I noticed some of those behaviors in myself, or I recognize some of those behaviors in one of my training partners or something like that? What would your kind of recommendation be to that athlete listening to this?
It's quite ironic because in an eating disorder or disordered eating, I guess one of the key signs of it is secrecy. And ultimately it's a big caveat because the individual suffering really wants to be seen and wants that support, but their behaviors are so secret, not of any fault of their own. It's the illness. But I think what I'm trying to say is, if somebody in your training group you feel is struggling, just be there for them. Ask them if they're okay. Be a listening ear. Check up on them. Do it in a way in which isn't too kind of pushy, which I know can sometimes be hard, especially when you're worried about them. But also sharing your concerns with other people. So we touched on at the beginning the importance of an MDT when working with eating disorders, and mentioning it to the coach or even the sports psych or even the nutritionist. And just kind of sharing that and supporting them where possible. And then I guess if we're looking at it from an individual who might think, okay, I'm actually displaying some of these symptoms myself, the fact that they have noticed it and have kind of come to the realization that they might be like experiencing a form of eating disorder is actually a really positive step during their journey or in their recovery, because of a lot of eating disorders kind of works around in denial, and they're in denial that anything's wrong. But simply just reaching out or asking for some support, or even doing it kind of anonymously, so dropping the psych a message or the nutritionist a message, and or doing it in a way in which you feel comfortable, because at the end of the day, it's such a secret illness whereby you've almost got this guard up. But when we slowly let that guard down, that's when all areas of the MDT will be able to help and give the best support possible in order to support the recovery.
Yeah, and then just I meant to ask earlier with regards to when we're talking about the prevalence. So you obviously named sort of like the big three, I suppose, of anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating. I think you mentioned.
Yeah.
Which are the most prevalent out of those? Are they the biggest three, or which ones in athletes would be kind of the highest prevalence, would you say?
Yeah, so you're right in saying they are definitely the biggest three, and binge eating disorder is the most common among the top three, with anorexia being the least common. And I guess that might actually come as a bit of a shock to someone, because when you say to a layman, okay, what's an eating disorder, they'd probably automatically jump to the fact of anorexia, because visibly they're incredibly underweight, and they look what an eating disorder they look what we've been conditioned to believe an eating disorder is. When we look at athletes, and I guess among athletes, eating disorder rates are significantly higher. Female athletes kind of have a 6 to 45%. 6 to 45% of them, will experience some form of disordered eating or eating disorders in their sport, and that again is a stat from Beat. And I guess a rise in the research and in the news recently has been that of REDS, which is relative energy deficiency in sport, which was previously termed the female athlete triad. And albeit not a clinical eating disorder, it generally goes hand in hand with clinical eating disorders. And what REDS is, kind of in a nutshell, is whereby an athlete doesn't match their exercise output to their energy input, and therefore the body kind of physiologically starts to shut down. So things like the female hormones and female menstrual cycle will stop because the body is preserving energy to simply stay alive. Heart rate will be crazily low. You'll be cold to the bone. Things like your digestion will go a little bit askew. Psychologically, things will be quite difficult to cope with, and there's a huge kind of array of strands that come off REDS. But I think within kind of the athlete space, REDS is probably the most prominent form of disordered eating, which then leads likely to a clinical eating disorder.
No. Okay. And you mentioned Beat. Was it Beat? How's that spelled? Sorry.
Simply just BEAT.
Yeah. Okay. So is that a resource that people can go to? Like, is there information on, I guess, information on eating disorders, but also is there kind of guidance, help for athletes, or where could we signpost if people didn't necessarily feel comfortable yet talking to someone? I'm just conscious of like signposting them to resources and kind of spinning this on you a little bit, because I didn't ask you to come with anything like this.
No, that's fine.
Are you aware of any kind of websites, any resources that we could signpost people to kind of read up on things or get support, get a bit of guidance on what they're experiencing?
Yeah, so Beat is a fantastic resource, and there is anonymous helplines on there. There's 24-hour support. You could ring people up. You can have kind of typing conversations with them, and there's so many fantastic trained professionals at the end of the phone on that website. And Beat is also another place whereby I often kind of point parents towards. There's a lot of parent help information on there as well, because I mean, the individual who's unfortunately struggling with an eating disorder doesn't necessarily know what's going on. So for a parent to deal with it as well, it's just as traumatic. Another really great resource is Project REDS, and REDS spelled RED with a hyphen then S. It's a kind of athlete focused platform, and the founder of it actually I think is a Loughborough alumni, and it's just a lot of support around kind of the REDS aspect side of eating disorders, but also a lot of kind of educational areas on there, some real lived experience from other athletes, so those who maybe are struggling will feel heard because people that they maybe know of are sharing their story. And then Mind as well, albeit kind of a bit more broad in terms of mental health charity, but Mind do provide a lot of support for eating disorders as well.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good one, just because obviously, like you touched on at the start, it's an underlying psychological issue, I suppose, isn't it, what results in an eating disorder or disordered eating. So it's good to sort of address that psychological issue as well. Okay, and then finally then, I always like, it's a difficult topic to do this with, but I always like there to be sort of a takeaway thing that someone listening to this can go away and think about, or go away and do, or go away and read up on. What would that thing be for you in disordered eating disorders? So athletes listen to this, what would you kind of suggest that the takeaway is from this?
I guess I've got kind of two key points. And I think the first one being that don't be ashamed or embarrassed if you feel like you are experiencing problems like this. Again, like we said, I mean, the stats say all, the fact that in sport, it's up to kind of a 45% increased risk of experiencing disordered eating and an eating disorder. So trying to catch it early and speak to people, speak to your support network is really, really, really important. And then I think simply educating yourself as much as you can. So you can look out not only for the warning signs for yourself, but also for kind of your teammates around you, or whether that kind of is through podcasts, or whether you go on Project Reds and have a look at kind of some of the athletes that have written in about their story. But simply just having that background form of education yourself, I think just gives you that support when you might need it, or when your teammate might need it as well.
Yeah, lovely. Good stuff. So, and then finally, this is kind of springing it on you again, but you were on a different podcast recently. I think it would be good to signpost people to that. I'll put it in the comments. I'll put it in the bio of the episode. But can you just talk to me about, or kind of talk to me about the episode you were on recently around diabetes and being an athlete with diabetes? Obviously, again, it's something that a number of athletes listening to this might have, so it'd be good for them as another resource to signpost them to that. What was that podcast, and where can they find that?
Yeah, so I was on a podcast called Type 1 on 1. So as you rightly said, I'm a type 1 diabetic, and I was diagnosed when I was 11 years old. And I've been doing gymnastics since I was 6 up until the age of 18. So I was kind of working in elite sport with this chronic health condition. And you can find it on Apple Podcast or on Spotify. And basically, I just talk about the way in which not only I was kind of diagnosed, but the way in which I navigated life as an elite athlete with a real kind of incurable condition that people. It's a very invisible condition, so people don't realize. Talking about the highs and the lows, I could get, pardon the pun, and talking about ways in which I really encourage anybody anybody in the population, but anybody who has got type 1 diabetes, to always participate in exercise and never let it be a barrier.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I thought it was just worth mentioning because, like I say, it was a really good listen. I found it interesting. I haven't got diabetes, so someone listening to this who's an athlete who also might have it, I think it's a good just to hear your story and how you kind of navigated it. It's probably the best word for it. Perfect. Well, thanks for your time, Abi. It's been really interesting learning about it. Obviously, it's a really difficult topic to sort of discuss, so I appreciate you kind of coming on and talking to me about it.
No, thank you very much. And it's been great to catch up.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for joining us on the Elite Sport Mentality podcast with me, Tom Evans.